My name is Sam. I was 32 at the time, working the graveyard shift at Harper's Hardware in a small town in Michigan. It wasn't my first choice for a job, but it fit my life then. I'd just gone through a divorce, and the idea of sitting in an empty apartment every night was unbearable. The late shift gave me something to do, an excuse to stay out of my cold, lonely place. I guess I was just trying to keep myself busy, to drown out the silence. Harper's was an old store, the kind with aisles so narrow you could barely fit a cart through, and shelves stacked high with things that hadn't been touched in years. It was the kind of place that smelled like sawdust and old paint, where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and flickered just enough to make you feel uneasy. Most nights were quiet. Just me, the aisles, and the occasional late-night shopper looking for a screwdriver or a pack of nails. It was early November, a Tuesday night, and it was dead quiet. I remember it was cold that night, the kind of cold that made your breath hang in the air. I was sitting at the front counter, trying to stay awake, sipping coffee from a chipped mug and glancing up at the clock every few minutes, counting down the hours until my shift ended. It was almost 2 a.m., and I was alone in the vast, dimly lit aisles. At least, I thought I was. I heard it then. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from one of the aisles toward the back of the store. My first thought was that it was the wind. The building was old, and it made all kinds of noises at night. Either that, or maybe a stray cat had somehow gotten in. It wouldn't have been the first time. I put down my mug and stood up, the stool creaking as I moved. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. There was no answer, just the distant hum of the heaters kicking on. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked over to the security monitors, a row of old, grainy screens that showed different parts of the store. I scanned them, looking for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, a flash of something, a colorful blur that moved across one of the screens. I leaned in, squinting at the monitor, but it was gone. I shook my head, rubbing my eyes. I was tired, I told myself. It was late, and I was seeing things. But the feeling didn't go away. As I made my way through the aisles, checking to make sure everything was where it should be, I started to notice things were off. A box of nails that had been on a shelf was now on the floor, its contents spilled across the aisle. A display of paint cans had been rearranged, the colors mixed up like someone had gone through them deliberately. My stomach twisted. It felt like I was being watched. I pulled out my phone, wanting to call someone, maybe just to hear a familiar voice, but there was no signal. I frowned, holding it up, waving it around, but the bars stayed empty. The store had a landline, but when I picked it up, there was nothing. Just dead air. My heartbeat quickened, and I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. Then I heard it. Laughter. Soft, almost playful, coming from the back of the store. My blood ran cold. It echoed through the aisles, a high-pitched giggle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I turned, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the store, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and the flickering lights overhead. I walked toward the front entrance, my steps quickening, but when I reached the doors, I found them jammed. No matter how hard I pulled, they wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in, and I felt my chest tighten. I had always been a little claustrophobic ever since I was a kid and got stuck in a closet during a game of hide and seek. The memory flashed through my mind, the feeling of the walls closing in, the darkness pressing against me. I had to get out. I grabbed a crowbar from one of the shelves, the metal cold and heavy in my hands. I wasn't going to let whatever this was get the best of me. I moved toward the back of the store, where the laughter had come from, my heart pounding in my ears. I turned a corner, and there they were. 2 clowns. Their faces were painted in garish colors, their costumes patched and worn, each of them holding a knife. They stood there blocking my path, their painted smiles wide and unblinking. I raised the crowbar, ready to fight, my hands trembling. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. They didn't move, didn't say anything. Then, one of them reached up, pulling off his mask. My stomach dropped. It was Derek, my ex-wife's brother. He grinned at me, his eyes cold. "Surprise, Sam," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The other clown pulled off his mask, and I recognized him too, one of Derek's friends. I lowered the crowbar, confusion and anger boiling inside me. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty store. "Call it payback," he said. "You hurt my sister, Sam. Did you really think I'd just let that go?" I stood there, the crowbar slipping from my hands, clattering to the floor. My mind was reeling. This whole thing, the laughter, the clowns, the locked doors, it was all a setup, a sick joke, twisted revenge for a past I couldn't change. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and strangely, relief. At least it wasn't something supernatural. At least I wasn't losing my mind. Derek and his friend walked past me, their laughter fading as they left through the back door, leaving me alone in the dark, empty store. I stood there for a long time, my heart still pounding, the adrenaline slowly fading. Eventually, I made my way to the front, found the doors unlocked, and stepped out into the cold night air. I took a deep breath, the chill filling my lungs, and I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Working late, running from my past, letting the ghosts of my mistakes haunt me. I quit the next day, found a new job, something during daylight hours, something that didn't leave me alone with my thoughts. But even now, sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear it. The faint echo of laughter, just at the edge of my hearing. And I wonder if, maybe, some ghosts aren't so easy to leave behind. Story 2. My name is Jamie. I was 29 then, living in Seattle, working as a graphic designer. It was mid-October, and I remember feeling completely burned out, the kind of exhaustion that makes you feel like you're just going through the motions. My boyfriend Ryan suggested we take a weekend off and head to Crescent Lake, to the cabin his family shared. He was hoping, I think, to put some life back into our strained relationship. And honestly, I hoped for the same. A change of scenery sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive to Crescent Lake was long but beautiful. The trees were all changing colors, leaves turning into shades of gold and crimson, and the air had that crispness that only comes in autumn. We left Seattle on a Friday afternoon and got to the cabin just before dusk. It was an old place, but cozy. Wooden beams, a fireplace, and a view of the lake that stretched out forever. It was isolated, no other cabins nearby, which I loved. It was perfect for stargazing, away from the city lights, and I'd always thought it was the perfect escape. We unpacked, made a quick dinner, and settled in by the fireplace. Ryan was trying, he really was. He told me stories about his childhood, about how he and his brothers would come up here during the summers and stay for weeks. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted us to make new memories, something to hold on to. I smiled, tried to laugh along, but that feeling of something being off just wouldn't leave me. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the distance we'd grown between us over the past few months, but I couldn't shake it. It was later that night, after we'd gone to bed, that I first heard it. Faint carnival music drifting through the woods. I thought I was dreaming at first, but the melody was clear. The kind of tune you'd hear from an old, creaky merry-go-round. I nudged Ryan awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He listened for a moment, then shook his head, pulling me closer. "It's just your imagination, Jamie. Probably the wind," he mumbled, half asleep. I tried to believe him, but I lay awake for hours, listening, the music fading in and out, just barely there. The next morning, I went out to grab some firewood, and that's when I found them. Clown masks, 3 of them, stuffed into our mailbox at the end of the driveway. They were cheap, plastic, the kind you'd buy at a dollar store. The sight of them made my stomach twist. I brought them inside, showing them to Ryan, but he just laughed. "It's probably just some stupid kids messing around. Halloween is coming up, remember?" he said, setting them on the counter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that it was something meant for us, something wrong. The day went by slowly. We went for a walk around the lake, trying to make the best of things, but that uneasy feeling followed me everywhere. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone hiding in the trees watching us. Ryan noticed, of course, and he tried to reassure me, but there was only so much he could do. By the time night fell, I was on edge, every sound making me jump. It was around midnight when the scratching started. I was sitting on the couch, reading, while Ryan was in the bedroom. At first, I thought it was just branches against the window, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was coming from the front door. My heart started to pound, and I called out for Ryan. He came out, groggy, rubbing his eyes. "Listen," I whispered, pointing to the door. He frowned, grabbing a flashlight, and walked over, peering through the window beside it. I moved closer, my breath caught in my throat. The porch light flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw them. 3 figures standing just beyond the porch, dressed in clown costumes. Their faces were hidden behind those same plastic masks, their bodies still, just watching. Ryan cursed under his breath, fumbling with the lock. "Stay here," he said, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "Something's not right." He hesitated, then nodded, stepping back from the door. We stood there, staring at the shadows through the window, the silence stretching out, thick and heavy. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, the figures turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. I remembered then something Ryan had told me once about Crescent Lake, a story about a group of convicts who had escaped from a nearby prison decades ago. They had hidden in the woods, using clown costumes they'd stolen from a local circus as disguises. It was just a story, something to scare kids around a campfire. But standing there, my heart pounding, it felt real. Too real. Ryan wanted to go after them, to scare them off for good, but when he reached for the spare key we kept by the door, it was gone. His face went pale, and he looked at me, the fear finally breaking through his bravado. "They have the key," he whispered. Panic set in then. We were trapped. I tried to stay calm, tried to think. "The basement," I said. "There's a window down there. We can get out." We made our way to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, my pulse pounding in my ears. Ryan went ahead, and I followed, my eyes scanning the shadows. That's when I saw it, a box tucked away under the stairs, half open. Inside were old photographs, trinkets, things that didn't belong to me. I picked up one of the photos, my hands trembling. It was Ryan, but not with me. He was with someone else, a woman, smiling, her arm around him. I recognized her. It was his ex-fiancée, the one he'd told me he'd left behind years ago. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to Ryan, my voice shaking. "What is this?" Before he could answer, the door to the basement creaked open and the clowns were there, their masks glowing in the dim light. They moved slowly, deliberately, blocking our way out. My heart raced, and I backed up, my mind scrambling for a way to escape. Then, one of them spoke, her voice muffled behind the mask. "Miss me, Ryan?" she said, her tone mocking. She pulled off her mask, and there she was, his ex-fiancée, her eyes cold, a twisted smile on her lips. "Thought you could just walk away?" It all fell into place then. The masks, the music, the feeling of being watched. It was her. She'd planned all of it, some twisted stunt to scare us, to scare him. I felt a mix of emotions, fear, anger, betrayal. Ryan stood there, stunned, as the other clowns removed their masks, revealing more familiar faces. Friends of hers, people I'd seen in old photos. They didn't hurt us. They just laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the small basement. They left us there, slipping out into the night, leaving us shaken and confused. I looked at Ryan, tears welling in my eyes. He tried to explain, tried to apologize, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't process any of it. We left the cabin the next morning, the drive back to Seattle silent and tense. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. All I knew was that things between us were broken, maybe beyond repair. And even now, months later, I can still hear that carnival music sometimes, faint and distant, like a reminder of everything that happened. A reminder that some people, some ghosts, aren't so easy to leave behind. Story 3. My name is Mark, and this all happened just over a year ago. I was 35, living in Willow Glen, a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone had a perfectly trimmed lawn and knew each other well enough to wave hello, but not much more. I'd moved into the house temporarily after my breakup, hoping some distance would help cool things off. The split had been messy, and I needed a place to collect myself, to figure out what came next. The house belonged to a friend of mine, vacant and conveniently isolated on the edge of the neighborhood. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. It was late August, an unseasonably warm night, and I was restless. Sleep had been elusive lately. I'd spent most nights half awake on the couch, a bottle of beer in hand, reruns of old sitcoms playing on the TV to keep me company. That night was no different. I had just settled in with an episode of Cheers when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't much, just a faint rustling, but it was enough to catch my attention. I muted the TV, sitting up a little straighter. Then came the knock. 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the front door. My heart leaped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I barely even knew anyone in Willow Glen. I hesitated, staring at the door from across the room, my mind racing. Slowly, I stood up and walked over, peeking through the peephole. The porch light was on, casting a dim glow over the empty front step. No one was there. I let out a shaky breath, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was just a prank, some kid messing around. I was about to turn away when my phone buzzed on the coffee table, making me jump. I hurried back, picking it up. It was a text from an unknown number, just 3 words. "They're coming." A chill ran down my spine. I swallowed hard, staring at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. I typed back, "Who is this?" But there was no response. The seconds ticked by, and the silence in the house seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on me. The tapping started a few minutes later, soft, rhythmic, against the windows. I moved through the house, checking each window, each door. Everything was locked, secure. But the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. I could feel it in my gut, a tightening that wouldn't go away. I grabbed my phone again, trying to call the police, but the line crackled and went dead before I could say anything. My signal bars dropped to nothing. I went to the back window, the one overlooking the garden shed, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures standing just beyond the shed, partially hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make them out. They were wearing clown costumes, bright colors, oversized shoes, the whole getup. One of them turned slightly, the porch light catching on the white of their painted face, and I felt my stomach twist. Panic set in. I dialed the police again, my fingers shaking, and this time, the call went through. I tried to explain, my voice cracking as I described what I was seeing, but the dispatcher sounded skeptical. "Sir, are you sure it's not just some neighborhood prank? We've had reports like this before in Willow Glen. It's probably nothing." Probably nothing. The words echoed in my mind as I hung up, my eyes never leaving the figures near the shed. They hadn't moved, just stood there, watching. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I needed to get out, to leave. but something in me froze. I felt trapped, like a mouse caught in a maze. It was an hour later when I found the Polaroid. I'd been pacing, trying to figure out what to do, when I heard something slide across the porch. I opened the front door, cautiously stepping out, and there it was. A single Polaroid photo lying face up on the doormat. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was me, asleep on the couch, the same position I'd been in just hours earlier. Someone had been inside the house. Someone had been watching me. I rushed back inside, slamming the door shut, locking it, my mind racing. How had they gotten in? How long had they been there? I checked every door, every window again, but nothing was broken. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the back door. It was ajar, just an inch, enough for a draft to slip through. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy wrench from a toolbox in the kitchen, and made my way through the house, every creak of the floorboards making me flinch. I could feel my pulse in my throat, each step taking me closer to the back hallway. That's when I saw them. Two clowns standing in the hallway, their painted faces turned toward me, grinning. I raised the wrench, my voice breaking as I shouted, "Get out! What do you want?" One of them held up his hands, palms out, as if to show he meant no harm. Then slowly, he reached up and pulled off his mask. My eyes widened as I recognized the face beneath. Someone I'd never expected to see. It was Eric, my ex-girlfriend's cousin. The other clown removed his mask as well, and I realized I knew him too. Another one of her friends. "Whoa, Mark, calm down," Eric said, his voice muffled slightly by the mask still dangling around his neck. "This is a misunderstanding. We thought this was Rachel's place." My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "Rachel? What the hell are you talking about?" The other guy stepped forward, his expression almost sheepish. "Look, man, someone hired us. Told us to scare her. Said she'd be here. We got the address wrong." I stared at them, the realization washing over me like a cold wave. They'd meant to scare Rachel, my ex. Someone had hired them to come here, to frighten her, and they'd picked the wrong house. My heart pounded as the pieces started to fall into place. Rachel's family had never liked me. They blamed me for the breakup, thought I'd hurt her. This was their way of getting back at me. Except they hadn't even bothered to make sure they had the right place. I lowered the wrench, my hands still trembling. "Get out," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Get out of here before I call the cops again." Eric nodded, grabbing his friend by the arm, pulling him toward the door. They left without another word, the door clicking shut behind them, leaving me standing there in the dimly lit hallway, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on the couch, the Polaroid in my hands, the TV flickering in the background, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, fear, and something else. Relief, maybe, that it hadn't been worse. The next day, I packed up my things and left Willow Glen. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened. I needed to move on, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But even now, sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear those knocks again. 3 loud, deliberate knocks. And I wonder if some things, some fears, aren't so easy to leave behind.